Munari. I'm the editor of Brewbound.com. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And thank you to Lagunitas for hosting this wonderful event. There's a few seats up front here, so please don't be bashful. We could use some company up here. Anyways, we've been doing the Brew Talks event series for a while now, and we were here last year in Chicago, and the event looked much different. It was a little bit smaller. We were over at the Hop Leaf in a bar, so it's fantastic to see just how far this has come and the kinds of conversations that we're starting to have at these things. It's really nice to see, and it's really great to have all the folks that have agreed to come up here on stage and sit with me for a little bit and chat about things. With that said, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you guys got questions, I think we're going to be passing a mic around for a few minutes after we're done talking. You can fire off some questions to these guys. We've got 3 talks scheduled this evening, a couple 30-minute discussions up here. One with John and Mike, who are sitting to my right now. I'll introduce them in a second, about branding and product strategy and portfolio strategy. The second, just about the Chicago marketplace and kind of what's going on here with craft beer. And that's with Wes Phillips from Windy City Distributing and Reyes Beverage. And the third with a man who needs no introduction, Tony McGee from Lagunitas. So big round of applause to those guys and Tony. Thank you. Also, this event wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, Owens, Illinois, and Beer Run Brewery Management Software. Thank you guys for supporting us and helping us get out here and covering a lot of the costs associated with this trip. We're live streaming this across the web, so there's a bunch of people tuning in right now. None of that would be possible without our sponsors. And for those of you who aren't aware, we're also raising money for a local nonprofit this evening. So all the proceeds from bar sales will be going to Foundations of Music as well as ticket sales. So 100% of the proceeds raised this evening will go to Foundations of Music here in Chicago. And I think we're either over $1,000 now or very close to it. So that's awesome to see as well. Without further ado, Mr. John Barley from Solemn and Michael Kiser from Good Beer Hunting, and a brand strategist, a portfolio strategist that has worked with a number of beverage and food companies over the years, as well as some technology companies, and Nike, I think, is in there as well. Yep. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's start with some, a little bit of background information on you guys. John, talk to me about Solemn Oath. Talk to me about how you got in the beer business, and then we'll move on to Michael.
Yeah, Solemn Oath, we started about 2.5 years ago, so we hit the market in May of 2012. I did not come from the beer business. I had never homebrewed or anything like that. I had a passion for beer. My parents lived in Belgium for a long time, and I just kind of developed a passion from my experiences over there, and decided this is something I wanted to do, and was visiting my brother in Southern California one time, and that was in August of 2010. And on the plane ride home, I started jotting down some ideas for something that I might want to do one day. And that was August 2010, like I said. And then January 2011, the business plan was locked down, and we were fully funded, and we were up and rocking. But yeah, I mean, we've been going strong, and we've been growing like crazy.
Cool.
So.
And a lot has changed over the last 2 years, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's interesting to see how you have sort of matured and developed as a company, and how things just in the way you approach the marketplace have changed. Michael is someone who's very familiar with kind of helping companies through that process as they grow, as they mature. Michael, talk to me a little bit about your experience with branding and portfolio strategy.
So mostly goes back to actual new product and service development when I was a design and innovation strategist here in Chicago for about 7 years. And I was working with companies like you mentioned, like Nike, Samsung, HP, Caterpillar, helping them introduce new to the market ideas, which is a really hard thing to do. And a lot of that comes down to positioning. And so that a lot of my experience was, how do you talk about something that's so new that needs some sort of frame for the consumer around what it is, what it's similar to, how it's different, things like that. I did that for 7 years, and the whole time I was writing about beer, which literally started just as a passion sort of project. Good Beer Hunting is kind of known as a content site more than anything. And it was sometime about a year and a half ago I realized that the market was getting a lot more competitive in beer, and that some of the brewing friends that I had were starting to ask questions that were very similar to the questions that the companies I was working with were asking all the time. And so that's when I kind of realized that there was probably a point coming when I could start working for beer, something that I had not only kind of a process knowledge for dealing with in terms of brand strategy, but also a deep kind of vertical knowledge with my passion around beer and how much kind of institutional knowledge I'd gathered over those years. And so, yeah, about a year and a half ago, I launched Good Beer Hunting on the consulting side and started doing brand strategy and portfolio strategy with breweries.
Interesting. And you're working with small brands, big brands?
Oh yeah, the entire spectrum, from some of the biggest, the biggest in the world to some of the smallest. I mean, a few homeboys in Indiana that I'm working with right now that are working out of their garage, and they have ambitions that are just as big as anybody else.
Cool. So now that we got your mic fixed, sorry if that was awkward. Josh reaching up there.
I didn't even flinch, honestly. It's all the time.
So I made it more awkward. I wanted to kind of start, preface this whole conversation with something that I read actually today on the plane ride in. We had gotten a press release from a brewery out in Spokane, and it's No Lie Brew House. John Bryant, many of you guys might know him. He's been in the industry a long time, and I was just kind of reading through the press release, and there was a quote that stuck out to me in there, and it was from one of their sales managers, and he had said something to the effect of, you can't just show up to work every day and think your beer will move itself, which I thought was a really nice starting place for this conversation, because I think there's a lot of craft brewers out there that we know they make good beer, they know they make good beer, and so they start a brewery, and they start making beer, and they expect the consumers are just going to pick it up off the shelf. And that's not always the case. Actually, very rarely is that the case. Yeah. There needs to be a story. There needs to be some kind of narrative. There needs to be a personality and identity behind a brand. And that's where folks like you come in. And John, you've done a wonderful job with it at Solemn Oath. So, that's kind of where I wanted to start. What's the first thing that comes to mind, Michael, when you hear, a quote like that beer is just not going to sell itself?
Yeah, the first thing I hear is that he's recognizing that it's a mature market, right? That there's a lot out there, there's a conversation amongst consumers that has happened for a long time. And so nobody's just sort of standing out because they make a quality product. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Drew Fox from 18th Street down in Gary, Indiana, who was just named Best New Brewery in Indiana this year by Rate Beer, and he's a year in. He was brewing at Pipeworks, and he was really proud of himself. He was really proud of the beer he was making there, and things were going well. And he called himself a brewer just in conversation one day with those guys. And BJ, I think it was BJ who responded and said, "Oh, you're not a brewer yet." He's like, "What do you mean? I make beer for a living." He's like, "Yeah, sure. Like anybody can do that, but a brewer, you're not a brewer until you know how to sell a beer." And I think at that point he was kind of differentiating between the craft of brewing a quality product and the sort of the task of running a business that is also a brewery. And I think that involves both sides. It's understanding what kind of products you need to make in order to resonate with the consumer in the marketplace and where it's at, but also how to talk about the beers that you want to make yourself and give them a chance in the marketplace, give them a chance to resonate with a consumer that you have in mind.
Right. Now, how about for you, John, when you hear something like that, when you started Solemn Oath, 18, 20 months ago, what was going through your mind when you rolled out the first product, and did you think the beer would sell itself, and what have you learned sort of since?
Well, a lot of it was building the right team to be able to do that for us personally, but not coming from a brewing background, and I had some friends that were in the industry that helped me kind of sift through identifying a brewer and then and that kind of element of it. But I had to trust that the beer was going to be of high quality, which it is. But when I hear a quote like that, and when I have conversations with breweries that are getting started or up and coming or anything like that, within 15 minutes I can tell if somebody's got the right mentality, and you even hear a quote like that and somebody's got the right, even to be cognizant of that element, and to what Michael was talking about, to be cognizant of that, you're already a leg up. It's it's a lot of different moving pieces from the distribution companies or not a distributor that you're going to work with. If sales has to be the focus, pull-through has to be the focus, getting fresh beer out there has to be the focus, and you try to minimize your mistakes while learning. So,
So talk to me a little bit about the identity of Solemn Oath then, and talk to me about sort of your starting point as a brand, as a company, and just kind of how you guys have matured, because I think it's a pretty compelling story for this conversation. You're a little bit different than when you started, obviously, not only just in the kinds of products that you're making, but just in the way that you're approaching the marketplace in general.
Yeah, we started off by design, not having any core brands whatsoever, and we still pretty much hold true to that today as well. But as part of it was out of necessity. It was availability of the products that we wanted to do, the beers that we wanted to make. We didn't have the opportunity to build a flagship around a Citra hop or something like that. We had to kind of work with what we had available to us. And at the same time, we didn't want to come in and predetermine and be like, listen, this is our Belgian Pale, this is our American IPA, this is what we're going to make. I hope you like it because we're not going to change it. We wanted to work with our distributors and work with how we felt about our beers to kind of figure out what we should be making on a year-round basis as opposed to predefining it. And that really drove us for a long time. And now, as we're maturing, we're kind of flipping that model a little bit and starting to introduce, not yet, but soon, some more core brands. And as opposed to the one-off being the kind of highlight of a sales point for us, it's going to suddenly be the complete opposite of that. So
has there been a process that you've had to go through on the brand side to kind of work through that story so that your consumers can kind of follow you along on that journey and understand, why you're making the decision that you're making to move away from, hey, we're this fun brewery that, constantly changing, we have new products, to you're going to be able to pick this up on the shelf, pretty regularly?
Yeah, and the effects of our strategy with that are yet to be seen because we haven't even rolled it out yet. It's certainly kind of something we've put a lot of effort into. We've created all these brands. We've made some 85 or 90 beers over the course of 2.5 years or so, and we've created an identity for every single one of them. So we've always had a heavy aesthetic focus. We've always had a heavy art focus, a heavy presence, and we've kind of utilized all these different marketing capital elements to introduce new brands all the time. And now that dynamic is going to let us focus a little bit more on the stories we want to tell, as opposed to kind of having to push out a story like that all the time.
It seems like not all of it seems like it was planned out 6 or 8 months, or you're only 2 years old, but
right.
What I think I've seen is that every time you do make some sort of significant change or significant sort of directional kind of decision, you've always been out in front of the story, and you've always sort of explained why, from your point of view, it's interesting or worthwhile, or why you wanted to do it at all. And that helps, I think, frame for your customers why you're doing something. So you kind of predict that you're going to get questions around, like, why isn't oubliette on every day I'm in here?
Right.
And you have a response that kind of comes from not only your strategy, but just sort of how you want to talk to your customer in general.
Right. Yeah, and to that effect, we also, what was I just about to say? I had it in the middle of your statement, and then you just kept talking, Michael.
Shouldn't try and interrupt.
That Lagunitas beer, man, it'll do it to you. Makes you forget things. When you hear somebody like John talk about how they have, 85 different beers and every single one of them has a different identity, how do you begin to kind of make sense of all that and start to zero in on the ones that they really need to focus on and put more of their resources behind as they, start developing a core lineup of products?
Yeah, I think the first thing it takes is self-reflection and awareness, right? Self-awareness, which is not something that everybody's good at. Most people are actually kind of oblivious to a lot of those things. They just kind of keep going based on whatever sort of patterns they see in the market or whatever anecdotal experiences they have with their customer. What I've seen at Solemn Oath, I think, is sort of a nice blend between just gut instinct and being willing to go for something, and if it doesn't work, adapt really quickly on the fly, but also really listening to the market and using that as great input. Those two things together, it's really hard to kind of mix those. But I think, the most successful breweries that I think can kind of do that on the fly, and I think Solemn Oath does some of it on the fly, they can do it because they have this, there's always like one person, at least one person at the brewery that kind of has it all in their head all day. And they think about nothing else except that business all day. And it's not just brewing, but small business entrepreneurship is kind of like that. So even if you have a team that has different roles, there's usually somebody walking around with that whole thing in their head all day long.
Right.
At Solemn Oath, that's kind of John's role. It's his job to obsess over that entire brewery, every little nook and cranny of it as much as he possibly can. So when it comes time to make a decision or jump on an opportunity, if you have somebody like that thinking about the brewery all day long, they're usually able to make a good gut decision with all those factors in mind.
Right.
Other places are a lot more sort of structured. You have 2 or 3 partners that are all kind of equal or all kind of play a similar role. It's a lot harder for those guys to move on a dime because they all have to sort of share their experiences to make a decision.
So how do you, a gut instinct or a gut reaction, that's not something that you can ever really explain or put a strategy behind. I mean, it really just kind of has to be felt by someone like John in the brewery that's got his hands on everything.
Yep.
And if it feels right, maybe you go with it. But as you grow, those decisions become more costly when you're wrong.
Not only costly, but harder to sell to the rest of your team.
Right.
I think as the team grows, it becomes much more difficult. You have to be really, really great at articulating why you have this feeling, or why you think there's an opportunity there. And you have to get the rest of that team to sort of believe in that, or else they're going to go out and execute it half-assed. In which case, it doesn't matter if it was a great idea or a terrible idea; it's probably going to fail.
And then somebody like you comes in and says, "Hey, I don't have anything to do with your brand, but I'm going to help you through this process." So, what's give us a glimpse into the blueprint a little bit
Sure.
of kind of how you work through that process of finding the gut instinct and really pulling out what's most important.
Well, I think the word process is key to it because what a lot of people, when they approach branding, they do it from sort of an aesthetic perspective. I'm not much of a hands-on designer these days. That's sort of ancient history for me, much more on the strategic side. And so I approach it from a process standpoint. I look for, there's sort of key points in the way. The first, I kind of do, most of the time I follow sort of a 3-phase process. The first part is like just really, really intimately getting to know these people. I've never worked with anybody remotely. Anytime they're from another state as far away as California or New York, I always go spend time with them, and that's sort of the first task. Is to understand who they are, where they live, the kind of people they spend time with, the bars and restaurants that they like to go to, other breweries that they frequent and sort of get inspired by, or things that they actually really don't like and they think are terrible ideas. Those are just as important. So that first session, I sort of call it just getting it all out on the table, and often that's the first time that those 2 or 3 people have ever actually said most of the things that they say in that session to each other. They just sort of walk around with their own idea of what that brewery should be like, but it's very rare that they actually share it with each other. So that's sort of, it's almost like a psychology session, really. That first time is really getting to know sort of their hopes, their fears, their aesthetic influences, inspirations, things like that.
And that's something that breweries can do internally, even
absolutely
with other members of their team or their business partner.
Yep, I mean breweries that communicate really well can do it really, like they can do it every day, and they have to.
Yeah, and to what Michael was talking about before too, I'm from a management standpoint, I'm a huge fan of arguments. Like you were saying, I've got a picture of what I see this giant ball rolling down a hill is going to be like in my head, and we might pivot here or there, but that's going to be the direction of that ball unless somebody in my brewery is strong enough to argue and convince me otherwise. So I mean, yeah, and like you were saying a little bit ago, just from a growth standpoint, early on when it was 3 of us, that was much easier, and now we've got 16 people I think in the brewery and 8 full time, but there's more voices, and we've got to I've got to convince more people that this is the right path. So yeah, we certainly go through.
And you're very argumentative.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, him and I have had this argument 100 times, I think.
Nice. So you said there were a couple steps. First is sort of the getting to know you phase.
Yeah, just getting it all out. And it's me getting to know them, but it's often them getting to know each other.
It seems like a little bit like self-reflection in a way.
That's a big deal. I mean, I think there's two types of breweries in my head for that first phase, and if they have sort of this sort of internal idea of what this brewery is supposed to be, they care about it in a personal way, or it's going to have that kind of character, you need to get that out. If that's not part of their future, they just want a business, they just want to be able to run numbers and make them work well and make a living. That's not so important necessarily. You're kind of looking at it from a more kind of market standpoint than a personal standpoint.
That's a good point to bring up too, is the fact that some people are natural marketers, and you and I have talked about this before, and they might have a natural vision of what this should be like. but not everybody has that, and you know, I think for those that don't, that are trying to build a brewery or grow a brewery or rebrand a brewery, from this perspective, it's, if they don't have it, they should realize it, and they should bring people in, you know, like Michael or you know, others that are out there that have that kind of vision to guide them down. You know?
And so that first phase is all about who we are. Second phase, I would kind of call that like, what kind of beers do we want to make? And then the third phase is how are we going to talk about it? Because all three of those things are kind of steps towards a process of actualizing that brand. And that phase of what kind of beers we're going to make, it seems really simple, especially to people who know how to make beer. But often the ideas that they have are oversimplified or sometimes too complicated for the market. And so in that phase, that second phase, I usually bring them a lot of market insights for their home market. Or if they're looking at doing sort of a split and sending some stuff nationally, you know, sort of like an import kind of market, I help them get up to speed on what other mature markets are really like so they can understand how they're going to compete. Because often you have a different strategy at home and away. You can sell yourself as local, first of all, you know, if you're in your hometown. But you can't do that halfway across the continent. And so you have to have a very different way of talking about your brand that way. And then the third piece of how are we going to talk about it becomes critically important. It has to be based off of the beers you're making make sense. Either it's what you want to make, or you know the market's going to be ready for them in some way, or you have to know that you've got work to do because you're going to make something really weird and have to sell it to a customer who's never heard that word before. And I've seen breweries struggle with that, and I've seen some hit the market ready to go and win over people on a really obscure beer style. And it works great, but it takes a lot of work to prepare for that.
Right. Yeah, and I think you see a lot of that right now. Just from a style perspective, you're seeing some of that with like the Goza style, and you know, some of these more obscure styles that I think you know, people are becoming at least a little bit more familiar with, even if it's sort of the 1% of people.
Well, I think Off Color here in Chicago, I think, realized that pretty early on. They were selling a Goza beer, and they were the first person in Chicago that I'm aware of that was doing that. In Chicago, nobody knew what a Goza was. You couldn't get a bartender to describe what a Goza was. And so that message was sort of like a game of telephone where it just fell apart on the way to the consumer. Nationally, in these little artisanal sort of markets, you know, in some of these urban areas where they were sending a small percentage of their beer, people knew what a Goza was because they were targeting a very different person. But in Chicago, you have to call it a tart wheat beer, and then it's going to sell. And so just understanding who your consumer is and what you're up against from a communication standpoint becomes critically important.
From a broader perspective, though, I mean, I think there is an element of, you know, selling an identity or a lifestyle for your company as a whole, not just specific brands that you market and produce, but just, you know, who you are. And kind of zeroing in on that identity can be difficult, not only for startups and maturing brands, but even, you know, some older brands that are kind of trying to, you know, start the fire again, or, you know, they're 20, 30 years old, and they're trying to find something again, a little bit of magic, and you know, get the consumer excited about their brand again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're inside of one of those right now. You've heard Tony, I've heard Tony talk about Lagunitas from that perspective before, actually, on a panel discussion we were in, and I'm paraphrasing and probably butchering it, but he essentially says something along the lines of, like, you don't get a timeless brand by changing it. Right? Like, it has to stay the same, and that's the whole point. And there are certainly brands that I think are going to go, you know, 20 years from now, they're going to look exactly the way they always have, and that's going to really benefit them. But then you see other brands that have sort of a timeless feel that are going through a revolution a little bit right now. New Belgium is a great example of somebody that just did that, and I think they're seeing it in the numbers. I don't know if you can see it culturally speaking. It's kind of a hard thing to judge in a moment in time, but like 20 years from now, are we going to think of New Belgium as from that same sort of inspiration point, or are we going to think of them as Ranger IPA? Right. I think it's a difficult thing to say.
Right. And there's, you know, all sorts of little things that go along with that, a redesign. I mean, a whole myriad of things. But, you know, I think you've probably had some pretty good insight into this, having worked with a lot of the bigger companies. You know, certainly they have brands that in and of themselves would be larger than most of the craft breweries out there.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're probably having their own struggles, you know, getting people excited about those brands again.
Yeah.
What's their process like, and
I mean,
you know, what can craft brewers learn from them?
Yeah, most of the struggles with a large brand are entirely unique to a large brand. If there's a brand that's, you know, one of the larger macros that hasn't changed in a while, it's because it doesn't have a brand manager. Typically, that's how it stays the same. Usually, that's how it doesn't get screwed up. Because brand managers at that level, at a large corporate level, and it's not just beer, it's any corporate level, they kind of have a 2-year shelf life before they move on to something else. And so they come in with this idea of, I need to make a big impact on this brand so that people notice it and I can use it as a case study to get the next job. They're kind of bouncing every 2 years, which is why so many of them make 3-year plans, because they want something to last just a little bit longer than you're going to be there. Right. But it's always a struggle. And so when somebody comes in and inherits a brand and doesn't have the mindset of protecting it necessarily, they have the mindset of, I need to leave my mark on this, you get stuff that just goes through rapid evolution constantly, and it makes it really hard for the consumer to really track that story over time, because there really isn't one. It's just a bunch of individuals pushing for change on something according to their own sort of anecdotal experiences, and usually backing it up with a ton of market research that costs them $250,000.
Right. How do they, internally, how do they kind of, I mean, just because it takes so long for them to pivot or rebrand or something like that,
yeah.
What kind of arguments have you...
That's why you see so many line extensions, because it's so much easier to build off of something that they already perceive that they have equity in than it is to introduce something new to the market. That's really, really challenging for them, because at that point you essentially end up focus grouping something to appeal to the most people possible.
Because what's that pivot, 18 months if they wanted to actually...
I mean, it takes them 18 months to introduce a single new beer, even as a line extension. An entirely new brand, that could outlast somebody's role at that company easily.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a huge advantage for smaller brands, obviously.
Absolutely.
Because
flexibility, adaptability,
yeah.
You can read the market and jump on an opportunity, or if you have something that you are just really personally passionate about, you've got the longevity of running your own company. You're not going to be gone in 2 years. You've got the longevity there to help build that in a slow, small way over time and actually arrive somewhere kind of unique and special that you couldn't have done if you only had 18 months to turn something around and show some impact.
Right. Are those macro brands watching the trends of the small, I mean, it's like AB, like, check out what they're doing down at Side Project. We let's do that.
Well, maybe not that small.
Yeah.
But, and every large company watches trends, and I think there's something that I saw in corporate America over, I guess, maybe the past 5 years, is that everybody, even at the largest corporate levels, still wants to do something cool, because they, the internet kind of changed the way I think that people kind of think about their jobs in a way. Like, they're always a fan of what somebody else did in another company that's cool. And so I saw, like, there were less people that were sort of in protect mode or don't screw it up mode, and a lot more people just going for something because they want to have an impact. And so I think what you're seeing is that when they look at those trends, they want to capitalize on it as fast as possible. But often those trends are so small that they'll never have the monetary return that a large corporation needs in order to keep funding it. $100 million in its first 2 years. I mean, what kind of a brand can really get that? I mean, that thing's got to be so fine-tuned for the market to have that kind of a return on it to justify continuing. That's why so many brands just get killed, because there's just not enough justification to put resources behind it.
But those big companies have, no problem tossing hundreds of millions of dollars at brands that ultimately end up failing after 2
Over time,
years.
they do.
Yeah.
They don't realize it at the time. I think they're willing to kill it because it seems like more of a loss than a gain.
And at $200 million,
but
an acquisition becomes a more...
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
More
That's why buying
approach.
a brand that's already got those things kind of figured out and just helping them to be better is much more attractive at this point. It used to be buy a brand, incorporate it into our machine, and then strip it for as much money as you can over time.
Now it's like, don't fuck it up. Yeah.
Yeah, now people are in don't fuck it up mode for sure.
Interesting. So we only got a couple minutes to chat, but one of the talking points that kind of came up in our conversation yesterday before this was that there's 3,000 plus craft breweries. All of them have kind of created some identity for themselves and aligned it with something else that they're interested in. So I'm interested in biking, so I'm going to have a bike-themed brand, or I'm interested in running, so I'm going to have a running-themed brand, or I like this particular piece of music, so I'm really going to go after that market. And sometimes it works, sometimes it is a little disconnected. Are there strategies for kind of reeling that in and separating your personal interests from what your sort of brand's identity should be, and are there any niches left? I'd love to hear both of your takes on that.
There's plenty of niches left. I think by definition there's always a smaller one. But I think basing your entire brand off of a personal interest is a tough thing to do. It's got to be, you've got to really be willing to put some work in behind that to tell that story constantly. I think Half Acre is a pretty good example of somebody who appeals to a pretty large audience, but they still have that sort of subculture of biking. They sponsor a race team, and it's part of who they are. And some people know that, and some people don't. It doesn't really matter to the brand overall. They're not banking everything on that. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's important to have a certain kind of tone. I think it's important for your culture to be visible to people, for them to take part in that culture a little bit, to them kind of understand the type of people that you are and what you're inspired by. I think that's different than building a brand on that specifically.
Yeah, I've always viewed it as, and kind of how we've approached that at Solemn Oath, is trying to build this thing up that's much bigger than us, and it's not necessarily a reflection of me or a reflection of anybody that's working at the brewery directly. It's not, this is that authentic to what's the story. Is it more important to have a better story? And we've always tried to build Solemn Oath as kind of its own beast, and we've got dark imagery and we have light imagery as well, and doesn't mean everybody's
like one's like an 80% black, not 100%
yeah,
black.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's kind of weaving it all into a larger story has always been our kind of overall goal, and challenging expectation and then setting expectation, and then when everybody thinks we're going to do one thing, we completely pivot and do something else. So it keeps it fun for us, it keeps it fresh for us, and as long as we're kind of on message with how we view it internally, and we don't really even say what our goal is overall. But
I think that's probably the most important aspect, and I could say this even just as a consumer, is it's not so important that I personally resonate with that brewery's point of view or what they're interested in.
Yeah.
What really resonates with me is that I can tell that somebody cared or thought about it or has an interest that comes through, that it doesn't just look like it's pandering in a way.
Yeah, you would use the example of a larger company perhaps holding up a mirror to millennials and saying,
being like, look, this is what you guys like, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Here's a brand that speaks to that. Yeah.
Yeah, you can smell that a mile away for sure.
Yeah. But I mean, that seems like a tough thing to balance, though. It's like you want to identify trends, you want to kind of play off of the things that people are interested in, but you don't want to seem like you're not authentic. You don't want to seem like it isn't coming from a place of real intent. So I guess how do you balance that stuff?
That can be done at a really large level. So I've done some work with Pacifico in the past, and that was one of the more unique cultures I've seen inside of a really large corporate holding for a brewery, because most of those people are, somehow they've been able to get the culture of what Pacifico is as a brand beyond just the brand manager. I mean, again, that person's there for about 2.5 years, even the current one. And so they can have a conversation as a group around what their sort of brand principles are and sort of the direction of that story that they've been telling for decades at this point. And they kind of know where their story came from. They've done a good job of somehow communicating the life of that brand to everybody around it. So everybody's kind of pulling from the same playbook or pulling from the same vocabulary versus everybody just sort of pitching ideas to try and do something new and interesting. And so when we were talking about the ideas for some secondary packaging and a can design, it felt like I was talking to people who embodied and internalized what that brand was about. And that's a really hard thing to do in a corporation that large, where people are constantly in and out of that company.
It shows the strength of culture, even a large company right there.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really challenging. And it's just as challenging, I think, at a small level when you've got 2 or 3 people, because again, usually you're coming at it from a personal point of view, and
right.
You're not necessarily sharing and communicating a lot of your thoughts and ideas.
Right.
You just say, I think we should do this, and they say, well, I think we should do this, and then you're just kind of stuck.
Right. All right. Final word on a final takeaway from both of you guys on what craft brewers can do to improve their image, improve their identity, focus in on the things that matter for their own personalities, and make sure that that resonates with consumers. How has Solemn Oath done it? How can brewers do it?
Man.
I'd say number 1, don't be beholden to a subculture. I've seen a lot of brands come out and they have a sort of cult following to begin with, and then when it comes time to actually grow and go beyond that cult following, you find out that nobody's listening, right? Or it's really hard to make sort of a jump to that next level of consumer. And if you're banking everything on that subculture to begin with, which is really easy and attractive to do because you're going to sell every ounce to that subculture, growing up becomes a much harder process. So I would say being a little bit more reflective on when you're...
Much more flexible.
Yeah, for sure. Like, stay a little bit more open to the consumer that's just beyond where you're at now, and kind of get to know them a little bit better. Like, don't close yourself off.
Listen.
Yeah, listen a lot more.
Yeah. And and to that point, if you can build a business and build a brand that's flexible, you can also kind of, take a little bit more risk at a more reasonable level as well. I mean, if you're dabbling in some different subcultures, if you're staying authentic and true to yourself and telling the story you want to tell, you can kind of pivot and you can kind of define your own niche. I'd rather much rather lead it than be reactive to to the industry and maybe carve out our own thing. We'll come across it at some point.
Play with it early on, so that you're not pigeonholing everything you do. Like, people think that branding has to be so consistent that, like, we do this one thing, we do it the same way all the time.
Right.
That's not a brand. That's a stamp, right? A brand is supposed to have some life to it.
That's an identifier. That's a way to stand out on the shelf and have a billboard or whatever it is.
Yep.
Interesting. These guys were awesome. How about a round of applause for them? Obviously, just scratching the surface here with how deep we can go down this rabbit hole of branding. Does anyone have any questions? We can pass a mic around. I know there might be someone out there with a question or two. If not, I'm just talking to a totally empty room. Our live stream viewers have no idea if there's anyone behind these cameras. Or maybe they do. Josh, do they have any idea? All right, cool. If there's no questions, I think we're going to get our next speaker up here. And just a reminder, if you guys want to get up at any time, get some beers, honestly, I'm not even looking at you guys, so because I'm just terrified of being on stage. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate
Pleasure.
it. If you guys need a refill, our next speaker is Wes Phillips from Windy City Distributing. Come on up.